Hi, everyone, and welcome to Adult Bible Studies. I'm Wayne Williams, and as always, it's my pleasure to be with you for this time of Bible study. Just to recap a little bit, this lesson this week is the fourth lesson in a five-lesson series where we've been looking at the book of Job. Uh, we have taken, or the lesson writer has taken this book, and for the sake of providing an outline and a cohesive kind of looking through the book, he's looked at five stages, emotional, cognitive, behavioral stages that uh, Job goes through as he deals with this intense suffering that he has upon him in this book. We started out the first week and we looked at how Job's initial response to the suffering was to worship. Uh, and how he turned to God for answers, turned to God for help and for consolement and for solace, for peace. The next week we looked at the topic of resignation, the stage of resignation, where it all really came finally home. Oftentimes when we're hit with something so traumatic and so drastic in our lives, it takes us a while to just kind of grasp the reality that, yes, this really did happen. I wasn't just dreaming it. And for Job, that time of resignation and understanding what was going on and coming to grips with that. Last week we looked at the topic of protest, and we saw how protest in that sense was Job entering into dialogue with these three learned friends of his who came to console him and to give him counsel. And their counsel was not inappropriate counsel in respect to the uh, understandings and the religious principles of their day. It's just that they didn't fit Job's situation. And because of that, their counsel wasn't very helpful, was it? They came to Job and they kept hammering him over and over again on that basic precept: if you do good, God blesses you. If you do bad, God punishes you. And they kept looking at Job and saying, Job, look at all these terrible things that have happened to you. You can't say that this is not because you have done something wrong. And Job says very clearly to them, I have searched my heart and I am convinced that this is not a response of God to something that I've done wrong. It's not a disciplinary kind of thing. It's something that has happened. Protest, and he protests back and forth. And these friends that come to Job, Eliphaz and Zophar and Bildad, they come and they share the worldly wisdom, the things that sound so good. Sounds a little bit like Paul on the Mars Hill talking with the Grecian philosophers about Christ and about the eternal life, and trying to help someone from outside of a sense of our own experience with God to understand where we're coming from. And Job was trying to explain to his friends, I understand fully what you're saying. It just doesn't apply in this situation. And after that time of protest, I mean, we've gone through almost 30 chapters here in Job. And these three friends have had two or three shots at Job where they've come back to him over and over again and kind of reminded him, you know now, Job, you know now, Job, you know. And Job has made it clear that no, you're off base. That's not helpful. That's not what's going on here. Today we look at the 30th chapter, and actually chapter 29, 30, and 31 are kind of a summing up chapter, section of chapters where Job looks to his friends and he again asserts his innocence. And in those chapters, he's very much just saying, I understand what you're saying. I've received your counsel. I have considered my ways, and I have checked all the things that I know. And I've even gone to God and said, Father, help me understand this. And that's where we're at today as we look in this. We're going to look at just the 30th chapter and just a little snippet of even that 30th chapter. I'm going to look at primarily verses 16 through 23. And I'm going to break these down into two different sections. The first is verses 16 through 21, uh, or 16 through 19, I'm sorry. And then we'll go back and look at the others. But here is Job responding to his friends, and he's getting a little angry. You know, anger is a good emotion. We don't like anger because we think of anger as people who are out of control. Anger is a strong emotion, and it doesn't take much for it to get into a very inappropriate way of expressing itself. But anger in and of itself is not bad. There are things that make us angry. There are things that are just not right, and we need to take a stand. We need to be people who are able to take a stand and to say no when no is really the answer. It's not just go along to get along. It's having a sense of right and wrong. And when things aren't going according to that sense of right and wrong, we get angry. We get upset. We look for an answer, an understanding of what's going on here. And we try to, as forcefully as we can, express that idea to others to help them to understand where we're coming from and change their attitudes a little bit. And that's what Job is doing here. He's responding back to these three friends and their appropriately inappropriate counsel that they've given to him. How's that for a thought? Appropriately inappropriate. And he's letting them know this is bigger than that. Here he says here, now my life is poured out on me. Days of misery have seized me. At night he bores my bones. My gnawing pain won't rest. I have great force, or with great force, he grasps my clothing and binds me like the neck by the neck of my shirt. He hurls me into the mud. I am a cliche like dust and ashes. I am no more than just the dirt of the earth and ashes, leftover stuff. Nothing, things are worthless. Things are just dirty and unclean. I have been taken down to the very lowest level of life. He's angry, and he's saying, I don't understand this. And friend, God knows that we get angry. And sometimes in our anger, we sin. But sometimes when we get angry enough, we actually get to a point where we stop and rethink and challenge those basic ideas that we've been living by that weren't quite whole truths, but were just kind of half truths. And we come to a point in our spiritual relationship with God where we travel down a new path. We come to a crossroad. And because of the anger, because of the strength of that and the power of that, we're able to look and consider and even choose a new path. So anger can be very helpful. And don't be afraid of your anger. Don't be afraid of expressing your anger to God. I'm not saying to be angry with God in the sense of putting him down and saying inappropriate things and actually going on the attack against him. But God is not bothered by me saying, Father, this just is not fair. I don't understand. My teenagers certainly had no problem with that when I told them I didn't think they needed to go out that night with their friends, and I didn't approve of where their friends were going to be going, and that sort of thing. They didn't have a bit of problem with telling me, that's just not fair, Dad. All my friends are getting to do it. Why can't I? Why can't I stay out a little later? Why can't I? And so an expression of that can be a very honest thing, a dialogue. It's trying to understand, trying to come to an understanding. My teenagers was trying to convince me that they had no intentions of getting into trouble. And I, on the other hand, was trying to convince them that it wasn't just a matter of trust. It was a matter of knowledge and wisdom and understanding of how things can get out of hand so quickly in certain places and at certain times and with certain people. And so the two coming together, it's an angry confrontation that brings them together. That's the power of the confrontation. The lesson writer talks to us about some situations where others, like Job, prayed to God in times of turmoil, in times of crisis. One of the examples that he gives is King David. Do you remember King David and Bathsheba? Well, Bathsheba was pregnant and had a son, and the son got sick. And David was so concerned over his son. For 7 days, he wore sackcloth and he assumed the correct postures of prayer and the correct means of prayer. He just poured his heart out to God, and still his son died. God's answer was not the answer that David was seeking for. He reminded us of Moses. Remember Moses? Just think of all the things that Moses did with God's help, of course, but nonetheless, it required his willingness to respond to God's will and direction. Think of that power of that relationship between Moses and God. Moses not only being able to interact with Pharaoh and others who were very powerful and negative towards he and his people, but even ascending to that mountaintop to receive those 10 commandments and those basic rules of worship and order for their nation as a new nation. And then to get to the River Jordan and to have God say, Moses, you can't go into the promised land. Moses pleaded with God, Lord, look at all that I've done. It's just not fair for me to get this far with these people and not be able to go on with them into this promised land. And God said, no, I'm sorry. That's not my plan. Sometimes when we ask things, even when they're the good things, God says no. Think about the Apostle Paul. Think about his thorn in the flesh. You remember Paul? He said 3 different times he prayed urgently, Father, please release me from this thorn in the flesh. Whatever it was, we're not sure. But it was something that bothered him enough that he fervently asked God to take this away from him. He felt it was an impediment that he felt like kept him from being the best person he could be for God. And I'm sure he negotiated with God a little bit about, Lord, don't you understand? If you take whatever this is away from me, think of how much more powerful I'm going to be and how much more dynamic and how much more able I'm going to be. And yet God still said, no, Paul. Look at the Psalms. As we go through the Psalms, and each week in this lesson, we've had a psalm that mirrored the theme or the image of the lesson. And we have a psalm this week too. And I encourage you to read that psalm and to hear its message in context of what we're talking about here with Job. But the Psalms are full of laments, where people come to God and they pray for his deliverance and pray for his power, empowerment, and pray for his lifting from them a burden. And we're never really sure whether those prayers are answered or how they are answered. And, here we are back to our example of the moment, Job. And Job prayed. And he prayed fervently. He got really into this. I mean, his emotions were stirred up. He got angry. And he said, Father, help me to understand. And wow, what he says in that response. If these examples were examples that exposed to us the dark side of God, and we saw that this was the way God responds to prayer, prayer would certainly not be a very significant thing in our spiritual lives, would it? And yet it's the reality that God so often answers our prayers. God so often says, I can do that, and I'd love to do that for you. Take this blessing and let it enrich your life, my child. Take this healing. take this sense of hope, take this empowerment. God so often responds to our prayers, and yet it's not an absolute sort of thing. We don't know the real why of that. I think in my heart it's probably because God is wise enough to see all the little uh, details of ramifications of one thing versus another, and He can see how it all fits together. And I trust God to have a plan and to be able to weigh those things out, and in true justice and in true loving kindness, to be able to do the things that's best, not just for Wayne, but for everyone. But we don't hear the answer here. Job doesn't hear the answer here, and yet Job still hangs on. That's one of the main points of Job, is not that God rushes in and takes all this away from him. It's that Job remains faithful in continuing to seek God's counsel, continuing to try to talk to God and to gain for himself understanding. That's what God wants with us. He wants us to have a relationship with Him. He wants that relationship to grow. And the only way it grows is by challenges and ups and downs and all of these things. So we've looked at the first part where of this 30th passage from the 30th chapter of Job. Job talking about my life is poured out on me. He's angry. He's saying, Lord, there's nothing else. I don't have anything else. You can't do anything else. You can't allow anything else to happen to me any worse than this. And he even, and as he changes his tone a little bit in the 20th verse, and he starts speaking to God directly. I cry to you, and you don't answer. I stand up, but you just look at me. You are cruel to me. Attack me with the strength of your hand. You lift me to the wind and make me ride. You melt me in its roar. I know that you will return me to death, the house appointed for all the living. Lord, I know that all that's left is death. I have been spent. My life is as good as over. My influence with my friends and my family and others has dissipated. All my wealth, all my ability to reach out to others and to be an instrument of your grace in this world are gone. And all that's left for me is to die. But even in that, Job entrusts himself to God. When we do a burial service at the cemetery, we often say, ashes to ashes and dust to dust. From the earth I came, and to the earth I return. God is our beginning, God is our end, and God is all that works with us and in us and through us, and all the middle parts of that as well. Job got angry. And because he got angry, I think Job was able to reach a level of insight and relationship with God that his learned friends were not able to touch. Now, that's not the end of the story, because there's another friend that comes along with them, a young man named Elihu. I don't know how old Elihu was, but he's just mentioned as a younger person, and he even says that he had waited to make a statement until he was sure that the elders were all through with their discourse, and then he lights into Job with his worldly wisdom, with his youthful wisdom. And certainly young people have wisdom. I'm not discounting that in any way. Our church does well when we include young people in on the decision making, and when we bring young people in to help them understand the whats and whys of the decisions we make. And yet youth sometimes does form a barrier and form a hazard for us. And so we have to weigh that out with wisdom. And what I think I see here is Job progressing to a level of wisdom and understanding and insight with God that certainly even his peers were not able to obtain. And this young man is really only showing his ignorance, so to speak, when he speaks so boldly to Job. Job continues to trust God. He says, Father, nothing's left for me but for me to die. But I die in you. I die with you. And I know that I will continue with you. Angry words that lead us to positive changes. Angry words that let us get rid of some of that emotion and be able to open our minds and receive some new enlightenment. I don't wish anger upon you in this week ahead, but I do wish upon you a new and renewed relationship with God. And I urge you to pray in that kind of fervent way that Job and others prayed in seeking God's will. Ask those questions. Sometimes God says, now's not the time for me to answer that for you. You're not ready to receive my answer. But so many times he does. And praise be to God when he does. And when we're able to respond and receive that gift, and our relationship with him can grow. That's what I hope for you in the week ahead. God bless. Take care.